they do not constitute a substitute for substantive empowerment for that matter. So substantive representation is one of the key concepts that we would be discussing today. We have with us today Dr. Ameena Zia, Brevard College, and we would be reviewing the contents of her book, Representation, a Study of Gender Quotas in the National Assembly of Pakistan. So Dr. Ameena, first of all, thank you for being with us today. And
you're welcome.
My first question to you is, if you would like to boil down the major arguments that you make in your book, what would say some 5 to 6 key takeaways be? What are you trying to tell the readers? How do you want to, change the discourse?
Thank you for that question. So one of the first things that I would like to mention was the observational outcome of this book was that we, in the context of Pakistan, when I was looking at the context of Pakistan, we know that numbers matter, right? But numbers alone don't tell us the entire story. And so just by having more women in parliament is important. But representation, we know, cannot just be measured by how many women occupy seats. So that's probably one of the biggest observation. The second point takeaway I would like to mention is that we know that presence of women doesn't, again, automatically mean that women's interests are being advanced, right? So one of the central questions of the book is whether women are actually able to influence policy and decision-making once they enter political institutions. Now, let's keep in mind this takes us a little bit towards substantive representation. And then the third key takeaway I would like to mention is that we know that gender quotas can be incredibly valuable because they do open doors for women. But at the same time, it's important for us to recognize that quotas have their own limitations. Specifically, if women remain dependent on party structures or other elite political networks. And in the case of Pakistan, that very much is the case because we know that women in the political space do come up the rankings in the political pipelines, which are usually gate-kept by political parties. The fourth takeaway I would like to mention is that women, we know, are not a single political group. Their experiences are shaped not only by gender, but also we need to recognize that women in Pakistan are also shaped by class, religion specifically, ethnicity, region, and even political affiliations, right? So there's a lot of intersectional dynamics at play that we do need to look at. So by highlighting that women are not a single political group, that opens up spaces for us to think about representation in Pakistan in regards to women in a very nuanced way. And then the fifth takeaway I would like to mention is that Pakistan's historical and political context, we know, really matters. We know that there are colonial legacies at play, Islamicization, nationalism, and also state building, right? And all of these things have influenced how women access public spaces, specifically political spaces, and also how women exercise their own political power. And also, how does that reflect women's agency in a broader sense? And then finally, a very meaningful inclusion I would like to add requires that we have reserved seats, but then we go a step further, right? So long-term gender equality always depends on changes within institutions, within political parties, and also the policymaking processes. So just by having reserved seats is not enough. And I believe that's one of the largest takeaways from this book, going back to my first point, is that we have to make sure that women can participate in real influence and authority. And then we have to take a step back and see, well, how do we define women's real influence and authority?
Right. So, if by descriptive representation we mean inclusion per se of women or any group or entity for that matter, then are you arguing that descriptive representation or inclusion does not necessarily mean that the institutions that women are occupying or of which they are part are actually accessible to them? That although they are present in those institutions, they do not hold the power or the agency or the capacity for that matter to actually make changes and contribute to a genuine issues. So, is this what the concept of substantive representation entail? Because there are certain readers who are not necessarily familiar with the concepts or the analytical frameworks that underpin the book. For instance, you draw extensively on Hannah Pitkin's seminal study, while also definitely adapting it to the present context. So, what is substantive representation, and how does inclusion, for that matter, differ from accessibility?
Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out. So, as you just mentioned, the difference between descriptive and substantive representation, I would like to dive a bit deeper into substantive. So, when we talk about whether women actually have agency, power, authority, legitimacy once they're in power, we're looking at, do women actually engage in substantive representation? And substantive representation is about what representation actually does. So, are these representatives actually representing not just who they are? Descriptive representation makes aware that we have women in these spaces. But political theorist Hannah Pitkin, as you mentioned, my book does use her study quite a bit as a beginning starting framework. So Hannah Pitkin made a very important distinction between descriptive and substantive representation. And descriptive is about, again, presence, as I mentioned, whether women are in parliament and how many. But substantive asks the question whether they're able to advance the interests and advance the concerns of the people that these parliamentarians or politicians or these representatives actually represent. So that again, in the case of Pakistan, the question is not simply whether women hold seats in parliament, because we know they do because of the reserved gender quotas. But the deeper question is whether they are shaping legislation, whether they have the access and the ability and the authority and legitimacy to advocate for policies that affect women's everyday lives. Do they have the authority, do they have the authority, the power, the influence to challenge, for example, discriminatory practices? And also, do they have the access to participate meaningfully in decision making, right? So there's a very big difference between just being in the room and having a voice in the room. And so in my research in the book, I argue heavily that substantive representation should definitely go beyond institutions. It should include recognition of women's lived experiences, and also questions of perhaps justice and the way that women navigate their everyday social and cultural barriers. Because again, when we're looking at the within the context of Pakistan, it is very important to understand that even defining the Pakistani women legislators' substantive representation will be different than defining substantive representation for women leaders in other parts of the world. And representation, we know, is not just political, it is social and it is cultural. And especially in Pakistan, it is embedded in the culture and also religiosity.
Yes. So I would like to, I want you to expand further on this point, because in the book you write that, and I quote, effective strategies for increasing women's political participation must be locally grounded, and that the narratives that drive these changes must be crafted and supported within the local context. So, do you think that the inclusion of indigenous cultural themes or religious or theological motifs, for that matter, do you think that that could actually advance the actual issue that is at hand? And second of all, we get to see that different groups and segments within the Pakistani society, whether they be religious scholars or people working in NGOs or academicians for that matter, they tend to be operating in certain institutional, ideational, and ideological silos. So, how important do you think is dialogue for that matter? And do we need to move forward towards a more towards an approach which is more sensitive to all the stakeholders? And how do we arrive at actually those strategies that are not self-defeating? Because we get to see, or at least what I've observed, is that radical slogans generally tend to be self-defeating strategies in the case of Pakistan. a group ends up, eventually demonizing the other, and that engenders this circle of reciprocal demonization. And we get to see that those strategies have not worked. So how can we incorporate indigenous culture frameworks, poetry, art, or theological motifs for that matter, to arrive at a more holistic and a more sustainable and viable strategy for advancing the agenda of women empowerment?
Thank you. That's a very loaded question. I think one of the key points is that women's representation in Pakistan cannot only be understood through the parliament alone. And so, as you mentioned, religion is obviously an important part of the conversation, but I don't see theology as a fixed barrier. And I say that because I think it's a fair observation that different interpretations of Islam have been used both to restrict as well, we know, to support women's participation in the public space. So this alone tells us that religion is really a space of debate. It is a space of negotiation. At times, it's a space of tension, but it is definitely a space of expression that should be included, that needs to be included in any conversation about political space for women in Pakistan. And I'll take your second question. You asked about stakeholders and the buy-in from the community. So community engagement is also very crucial because we know that many women develop leadership skills long before they enter formal politics, right? So where are those skills emerging from? They often build experience, we know, through local organizations if they're part of that, or through educational initiatives, grassroots movements perhaps, and also community networks, right? So are there enough opportunities for women to access all of these spaces that help develop community and for women to engage within the community space, right? As a participant, as an active stakeholder within initiatives and movements and networks. And then there's the idea of civil society that you mentioned. So we know that the women's rights organizations, advocacy groups, and also legal reform movements have played a huge role in expanding opportunities for women and pushing gender issues into the public conversation. And I talk about that quite a bit in one of the chapters in my book. But I also believe, and through my observations, I have stated in the book that there needs to be an active, a very intentional bridging of the gap between civil society organization, between the civil society, the academia, the politicians, and also community advocacy. Because once all stakeholders are brought to the table, that is the only time that intentionally processes and systems can be changed or reimagined. I like to use the term reimagined and recreated. So when I think about representation, I see it as a much broader um, uh, concept than just looking at parliamentary seats and how many women occupy these seats. In the book, I argue that women's representation includes cultural recognition. It also includes community participation, as I just mentioned, and also collective action. And what does that collective action look like? Because collective action, we know, looks very different in different areas, even within Pakistan. You mentioned indigenous communities. It is very important to bring in the role of indigenous communities within the larger framework of culture, politics, social fabric, and economics of Pakistan. And so, are we able to do that? Are we able to negotiate? And are we able to engage in a viable discussion around uh, systems and changing systems so that there is access for all culture, society, and economics um, to work together. So those spaces often also determine whether political representation becomes meaningful or is it just largely symbolic. And I think that
So, the first thing that we as academics or social scientists need to do is to reconceptualize the very concept of representation and to redefine it in a manner that takes into account the sociological and historical circumstances of our present day context, right? This is the argument that we are advancing. that concepts cannot be just borrowed and imported and implanted, but they need to be contextualized and they need to be adapted according to the needs and the demands of the circumstances. But then we get to see that modern political science discourse tends to be blinded by this reductionist approach and this thirst for quantification, this metricization. So we want to metricize everything and quantify all the variables that could potentially be studied. But then you highlight the limitations of a purely statistical approach in your book, that statistical approaches and data, although you quote data liberally and your book is full of references and data and facts and figures, but you're also keenly aware of the limitations of these methodologies. But when I tend to look at the legislative studies discourse or the predominant political science discourse being produced at the research being conducted in
Mm.
universities, I what I observe is that reductionism still predominates, even though subconsciously for that matter. So how can we, develop newer frameworks that could actually be useful and efficacious for our present day context? Because our frameworks of analysis are equally important. If our lenses are not properly adjusted, we cannot analyze things, and that is where you bring in the concept of substantive empowerment. So how do you think that substantive empowerment is the lens that we could actually use to decode not only the issues but the hindrances as well as the potentialities that are inherent, and that this purely quantitative approach cannot do those things? And how do you include, for again to build on the previous question, how can we include like poetry and art? Because generally, we tend to separate the two, like the lived experiences of women, especially insofar as they are expressed in their everyday economic transactions, poetry, art, they tend to be sidelined. And they are generally seen as if they are not useful for any academic study or serious discourse or research for that matter. So, what is your message to young scholars, and how can we pick up on the threads that you lay out in the book, especially the theme of and the concept of substantive representation?
Thank you for that. Yes, you pointed out some very important things that I highlighted in the book. And one of those is that, when we're looking to observe, investigate, and inquire in social sciences, we obviously start with a framework, right? A conceptual framework. Well, it's okay as a scholar, especially it's okay as a young scholar, to take a step back and reimagine a framework that integrates everything that you're wanting to study, investigate, or inquire about, right? And so that is exactly what I did in this book. And so my basic conceptual framework began with Hannah Pitkin's theory of representation. And then I expanded on that, right? I wanted to broaden that framework and to redefine women's representation in Pakistan because I wasn't finding it in the literature that I was reviewing, and I wasn't finding it in documents and reports and a lot of these publications that were available in Pakistan through either journalists or through others who had taken the time to put those together. So with my book specifically, I built on Pitkin's theory, and I propose integrating models that combine symbolic and ethical representation. And I think that that is extremely important. And there are a few other integrated models that I looked at. For example, as I said, symbolic and ethical representation. What I mean by that is I looked through works of Faiz Ahmad Faiz and Kishwar Nahid to try to understand the conversation, the narrative that was building around concepts of agency and representation in general. Specifically with Kishwar Nahid's work, I looked at, oppression. I also looked at inclusion and exclusion and what do these terms actually mean within the context of Pakistan. The second integrated model that I utilized was political and institutional agency, and that looked at the experiences. And I developed my own framework to look at these experiences through the works of Fehmi Demirza. And then I looked at, of course, structural analysis, right? And that was through Patricia Hill Collins' work of leadership and power and influence, who holds power. And then also intersectionality, we know is was coined by Kimberlé Crenshaw, and I use intersectionality as an approach in a lot of my work because I think it helps us understand the multiple dynamics and facets of observation, and also gender norm disruptions, right? So especially in Pakistan, in the context of culture, history, post-colonial, pre-colonial and post-colonial history of Pakistan, and also trying to understand, the lived realities of women every day. I looked at Judith Butler for gender norm disruptions. And then also, finally, I looked at political economy and militarization through the lens of Cynthia Enloe. Because we also cannot talk about what representation in Pakistan means and also systems in Pakistan, right? So do these systems need to be reimagined? Do these systems need to provide space for women, provide access? And what do we mean by access? And what do we even mean by agency? So the goal was to move beyond just asking whether women are present in institutions, right? Whether women are being or whether are we seeing women in these spaces, right? But then rather the idea was to move towards understanding how are women recognized in these spaces, how are women empowered in these spaces, and also how are they represented across political, social, economic, and cultural spaces. And once women are in these spaces, do they have the legitimacy? Do they have the power? Do they have the agency to bring about change or to make policies, etc.? So ultimately, we know that women's representation in Pakistan lies not only in the increasing number of women in office, but also in creating conditions, right? So are these conditions present where women exercise very meaningful authority? And I keep coming back to this term authority and legitimacy. And also, are they able to influence policy outcomes? Are they able to shape public discourse and to transform perhaps the structures, right? The systems, the structures that have historically limited participation, not only of women, but also participation of other minorities, and especially Indigenous experience. So this is a huge progression, I would say, from descriptive representation to substantive representation. And ultimately, we know that in order for any system to be transformative, it has to be inclusive. So the idea is that then there's this powerful normative framework. And well, what is this framework? So my call to action to young scholars is that do not hesitate to look beyond the parameters that have been set for you or the parameters that you have been exposed to. Dig deeper, keep looking, because the more we can dive deeper into defining concepts for the space that you're studying and observing and investigating, that will really help understand the outcomes. If I may, I do want to read a passage from the book that talks about poetry, because you brought up poetry. And I do utilize poetry and literature in general quite a bit in understanding what representation means substantively in Pakistan. On page 79, I mentioned that in Pakistan, Urdu poetry is not exclusively a luxury of the cultural elite. Rather, mushairas, poetry readings are an established and popular convention of the Pakistani society and were utilized extensively as a means of vocalizing messages during the struggle for freedom and oppression, etc. So when we know this to be true, and we must include that when we're trying to understand the political representation of women. I will read a little bit further down on the page. I point out that Urdu poetry by women writers often offers glimpses and a better understanding of the position of women in society, their cultural and historical environment, and their personal struggles against the established norms of the patriarchal society. And especially in Kishore Nahid's work, She has utilized the Urdu poetic form of ghazal to critique the local and nationalist interpretations of spaces for women. And similarly, we know that Fehmida Mirza also employed the use of free verse. She used nazms to highlight the increasing patriarchy of power by questioning the interpretations of religion and also the suppression or repression of women.
Yeah, that's really beautiful, and that's something very novel and very unique about your book and your entire way of looking at things. And on a side note, I wanted to mention something. In your book, you write that in the book you write Pakistan was founded in the concept of political representation. So I have not come across any single sentence that so succinctly and so briefly yet so all comprehensively captures the essence of the ideational imperative of Pakistan. So when I first read this line, it felt as if I were in a moment of epiphany, and all my
Mm.
confusion pertaining to like the ideational imperative of Pakistan and the vision that was driving the Pakistan movement and all the major leaders, including the Qaid and others.
Very intentional experience. It has to be an intentional experiment, and also creating systems that are viable, systems that will help the society of Pakistan thrive. Also have to be a very intentional project because the story of Pakistan was so intentional. Does that answer your question?
That answers very beautifully. Now I would like you to take you to discussion of identity politics. So generally, we tend to see, especially from those drawing on the classical liberal discourse, that identity politics is a particularly loaded term. And second of all, there's this idea that all forms of identity politics are inherently harmful or otherwise necessarily have like tend to fragment the society. And this objection is often laid against all forms of quota systems, whether they pertain to gender or any ethnicity, or for that matter, peripheral provinces in the case of Pakistan. That they tend to undermine meritocracy, and they tend to further solidify and even reify the collective social identities. So we know that classical liberalism it tends to give primacy to individual identity over the collective identity. But all forms of identity politics, including for that matter the quota system, they tend to foreground the collective social identity, whether that pertains to gender or to ethnicity or to any other form of affiliation. But the problems that Pakistani women or the certain ethnicities for that matter confront are actually too different for lenses such as that of identity politics to be adequately captured. So, do you think that identity politics, for that matter, is a useful lens to analyze the socio-political circumstances of Pakistan? And second of all, do you think that all forms of identity politics are necessarily harmful, or that they tend to fragment the society, undermine meritocracy, and they tend to give primacy to our collective or group identities while sidelining the individual identities that we have? Because that is the criticism that has been leveled by the likes of Dr. Jordan Peterson, for that matter, or other
Mhm.
scholars. And do you think that even these arguments are even relevant for the case of Pakistan, where women and different do not have access to basic facilities? And if not, what frameworks should we then be using? I mean, we discuss identity politics, and
Yeah.
we conclude that yes, these lenses are insufficient, and yes, we need to move towards other concepts, for that matter, substantive politics. But how do we, as social scientists who have been trained in these theories and in these theoretical traditions, disentangle ourselves from those lenses? And when I do try to disentangle myself, I need something new, and I think that your book does a pretty good job for that matter. So what would you have to say on these issues?
Thank you for that observation. I think this is a very important point that you bring up for, especially for young scholars as they're just now diving into the world of inquiry. So, identity politics is a very heavy term. And but what does it really mean, as you mentioned, in the context of Pakistan? And groupthink. And what does group identity mean in the context of Pakistan? So, in order for us to bridge the gaps, even in academia, between these terminologies, it's important for us to take a step back and recognize that perhaps these terms and these ideas may not be only enough for Pakistan. And I say only enough because absolutely they should be utilized as starting points. They should be utilized as a lens to decode data that you're observing, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. But I am a firm believer that none of these terms should be used alone in trying to understand the context of Pakistan, whether we're trying to understand religious, social, cultural, or economic paradigms. And I say that because a lot of times we have to contextualize where these terms are coming from. What are the origins of these terms? Did they come out of a need, for example, for other people in other parts of the world and for basic necessities that they already had, and now they were looking for more influence and more power in society? But in the case of Pakistan, you make a very important point. Basic systems are not operational where women have access to the mainstream systems in society. So when we relegate women's agency to a buzzword or to a theoretical lens, we are limiting women's participation in the public spaces and public life. So what do we do if the things are that you're studying do not fit into a solid lens or a theoretical framework? Well, you go out there and you create your own framework, right? That's what I did in this book.
Like you did.
And because something that works in one part of the world is not going to work, for example, Pakistan's context. And I think that it's not to say that we need to negate all of these lenses, but we need to be very mindful of the way that they are being utilized within the context of Pakistan. And I say that because, as I mentioned, Pakistan was created intentionally because the community believed its voice could not flourish, right, without meaningful representation. So that history teaches us that thriving societies do not emerge from passive institutions. They require very intentional systems that recognize that people need to be included in decision making, and people need to have access to systems. So the question for Pakistan today is whether we are extending that founding principle of representation to all citizens, including women, right? And so what are the frameworks that can help us identify the observational analysis of that? And I would like to add to your point that when institutions are intentionally inclusive, we know that representation becomes not only of democratic value, but also it's a catalyst for development and for further social flourishing, and even in academia. So the argument creates this natural progression, right? So do we have frameworks and systems in place, especially in academia, for us to observe and utilize as a lens? Yes, they are present. But when we're looking at representation, we're looking at it as a political necessity. Is it substantive, as we mentioned? And also, we're looking at women's political agency.
This is a question I want you to go back to the concept of identity politics. Do quotas risk rareifying identities? Is there a risk if we go down the route of identity politics or quota-based politics for that matter? Do we then run the risk of rareifying collective or group identities? Or do you think that an overblown threat and it does not in any way apply to the case of Pakistan?
So that's, yes. So when we're looking at identity politics and when we're looking at gender quotas specifically, gender quotas are a temporary stopgap measure um, to bring about change within the system. Now, let's run with that for a second. We have quotas, we have reserved seats, right? So we have an X amount of women parliamentarians in office. Great. We achieved it, we're done. Nothing else needs to happen. That's not true, because once we have these women in these public spaces, political public spaces, do these women actually have any authority or legitimacy, as I mentioned earlier? In order for that to exist, we need to change systems. Well, how do we change systems? Do we change systems by relegating women to the side and by giving them this identity of you are a women parliamentarian, so this is what you need to do. These are your roles and responsibilities, but please stay in your own little space. No, because that doesn't help change the system. So we know that identity-based lens suggests that gender perhaps can shape priorities and experiences for women, but there are limitation and potential harms, as you mentioned. So we know that women are not a single unified group. And I mentioned that in my book quite a bit. And one of the criticisms is that identity politics in itself inherently does treat women as a homogenous category, which again, we know is not true. So in Pakistan, for example, experiences differ significantly across the board depending on whether women live in the rural area or they reside within urban areas. Are they rich? Are they poor? The different ethnic groups they belong to, and even different sectarian and religious communities, right? And also, are these women educated? Do they have access to proper education institutions, etc.? So all of these factors play in, and within the elite female political um, space, we know that there are major political families at play that may not share the same interests as the rural working class woman of Pakistan. So that in itself is a very large example of why relegating identity politics when learning and studying women in political spaces alone is not enough. And therefore, an intersectional approach, an integrated approach is necessary. So this criticism is also often, I want to highlight, addressed through intersectionality, right? That's why, as I mentioned, it's important to look at other approaches because we absolutely need to examine how gender interacts with class, ethnicity, and religion specifically in Pakistan, because religion is so embedded within the Pakistani fabric of everyday life. And also regions are very important because we know that Pakistan in itself cannot be regarded as a homogenous community, right, of Pakistanis. So I also want to talk a little bit about when we talk about limitations, there's also symbolic representation can somehow um, at times replace substantive representation. And that is what we are talking about here. Identity politics focuses heavily on who is present rather than what is it that they do, right? So, and when we speak of substantive representation, we are trying to answer the question, what are they actually doing to support women's advancement? So we know that there are gender equal policies that need to be adopted. We know that women's rights need to be improved, and also marginalized women, whether they're marginalized through their indigenous experiences or religious minority experiences or socioeconomic experiences or lack of education, they need to gain influence, right? So these are the very real ground realities of representation. But some female politicians may support, for example, traditional or conservative policies. Therefore, we know that descriptive representation, having women present alone, is not enough within the context of Pakistan. And we also know that substantive representation, which leads to women's interests being advanced, are also not the same for these women. So how do we ensure that we are not falling into this trap of, identity politics within Pakistan? Is by making sure that we have broader structural focus. And also, I want to point out that if political problem is viewed mainly through identity, then other factors don't receive attention, right? So what are we missing out? We're missing out economic inequality, as I just mentioned. We're missing corruption? We're not looking at weak institutions. And do we need to reimagine or change institutions? And also, we are missing out the very important factor of the military influence in politics and also the patronage networks. And so all of these things do factor in when we're trying to understand what representation for women looks like and what representation for women means. So purely identity-based explanations may be too narrow. And that's why to really understand the full experience and to exercise women's agency in the political space, we need to have a larger, broader sense of definitions and concepts and frameworks. I also want to talk a little bit about the elite capture, because this comes up in a lot of conversations and discussions that I've had about this book specifically. So we know that reserved seats and gender quotas can sometimes benefit women from very powerful political families rather than ordinary women, right? And so that takes me back to some of my work, not in this book, but some of my other work on political parties and party structures. Who has access to the political parties? And once they're within the domain of the political parties, do these women have enough networks, enough social capital, enough economic capital to even move up the ladder, right? So, but, critiques argue that identity politics may empower a small group of already privileged women. But let's also keep in mind that that also leaves deeper inequalities untouched. And these are all of the inequalities that we talked about. So your question was, should identity politics be used? I think it should be used. It should be used in a way to help understand. It should be used as a lens of observation, but it's not the only lens that should be used. A balanced academic approach is very important, and it should be used as an analytical tool, just as one analytical tool. And so in Pakistan, we know that identity politics is valuable because it reveals a gender-based exclusion, and it also justifies efforts to increase women's presence and participation. So through that lens, yes, it's important to utilize it. But we cannot rely on it exclusively on trying to oversimplify women's experiences. And also by oversimplifying women's lived and real experiences, we are ignoring, again, the differences between the class, ethnicity, region, and political power, which are so important in understanding women's political representation. That is key. So if we solely, to answer your question, if we solely look at identity politics, we are actually hindering the understanding and observation of the reality of the political woman parliamentarian in Pakistan.
Identity politics tends to flatten the diversities that exist within the agendas that are being presented by different women politicians. Substantive empowerment as a concept emphasizes precisely those differences, and it urges and compels us to ask whether or not the women politicians are actually contributing anything substantial by their presence in the corridors of power. As I see it, a substantive representation as a concept is quintessentially different from lenses such as that of identity politics, which tend not only to flatten those diversities, but also to give this idea as if there were these monolithic groups of women politicians or ethnic minorities, or for that matter, Muslim minorities in the US. I think that's the major problem with identity politics, and the very concept of substantive representation serves as a very profound corrective to such limited lenses. And so, and since we have discussed all these things, what's next in your journey? Now that you have already penned this monumental work.
Yes, so before I jump to that, I do want to make a last point about identity politics, is that inherently, identity politics is neither harmful nor is it sufficient on its own, correct? So specifically, I want to reiterate that in the case of Pakistan, in the context of representation, it helps us to expose gender inequalities and supports efforts to increase political inclusion for us to have quotas and reserved seats. However, I want to add that it becomes very problematic when it assumes that all women share the same interest, the same priorities, and symbolism is then advanced over policy outcomes, which ends up happening with identity politics, as we know, as research shows us. And it also ignores other forms of inequalities, as we mentioned, economic, educational, etc., and also agency. It does not help us define women's agency in the case of Pakistan. So that's why I just want to reiterate that identity politics is most effective when it is used only as part of a broader, perhaps a multidimensional analysis of representation, power, and legitimacy and authority.
Right. So your book represents, and I quote, the beginning of the exploration of women's substantive representation in Pakistan. And I believe that it does so by building on very firm foundations. And as the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes said, that when men build on false grounds, the greater they build, the greater the ruin. So similarly, I believe that when women build on firm foundations, the greater they build, the greater the glory. So what prompted you into penning this work in the first place? What brought you to these ideas and to reconceptualize the very concept of representation and to revisit these issues in a completely new light?
Well, the project really began with a very simple question, as we mentioned before. Does political inclusion actually lead to political power? That's a very simple question. And Pakistan, as we know, is a very fascinating case study because it has one of the most established systems of gender quotas, right? And so in the international context, but yet women continue to face significant structural barriers in politics. And so I became interested in the gap between inclusion and influence. So a lot of research in academia focuses on numbers,
Right.
purely quantitative numbers, and how many women are elected or how many women are appointed. But I wanted to look beyond the statistics, and I wanted to ask whether these women were really able to shape policy and become actual institutional agents and create and curate their own institutional agendas. And so that led me, as I mentioned earlier, through this journey of frameworks. Hannah Pitkin's obviously is one that I utilize and I build off of. Um, but I wanted to explore that tension. When quotas create meaningful political agency, what happens, right? So it's a very simple thought process. And when do they risk becoming more symbolic than transformative? Because that's one of the biggest risks of gender quotas. As I mentioned earlier, gender quotas are only supposed to be a stopgap measure, right? They're not supposed to be part of a political structure for long periods of time. But ultimately, I was also then interested in understanding the structures and the systems, the mainstream structures and systems that enable women to be able to participate, to be able to have access to public space, and the limitations of those structures and system. And I'd like to even make it more. I would like to express that understanding women's representation is a journey, right? It's a conversation we need to have. The space needs negotiations, the space needs expression, the space needs stakeholder approach and participation and buy-in to try to understand very intentionally the systems that will make spaces available in politics for women.
So your book lays the first informative brick, but not necessarily the final brick, right? If-
Absolutely, absolutely. So the next step is really important because it moves beyond questioning just the presence. And, we know that for years scholars have asked, are women in the room? Well, I'm increasingly interested in asking what happens once these women are in the room. And then perhaps also beyond that, how do we create systems where women can genuinely shape outcomes? So my current thinking brings together the ideas from political theory, and as I mentioned, intersectionality, feminist scholarship, and also Pakistan's own very checkered political history. I'm interested in how women gain recognition, how women exercise agency, and how do they influence institutions?
Right.
And how can they challenge their limited participation, right? So that's also key. Are women able to challenge the systems? And ultimately, I think that the conversation needs to move from descriptive representation to substantive representation, and then towards what I call transformative representation. So perhaps the next step is representation transformative in the case of Pakistan, where women are not only present but are actively shaping policy and actively shaping the public discourse and bringing about institutional change.
And conventionally, the discourse, it proceeds in this dialectical manner and gives us these either/or propositions. Should there be quotas? Should there not be quotas? But what your book does is that you grab the readers by the collar and you compel them to ask the question as to whether or not they were asking the right questions to begin with in the first place. And I think that if I'm ever permitted to use the term, you sort of postmodernize the discourse on gender quotas in Pakistan. by giving us this completely new framework that yes, we were not asking the right questions to begin with. We need to change our frameworks. So, would you like to add anything else?
One idea that has become increasingly important through these discussions and dialogues around reserved seats and gender quotas is that Pakistan itself was founded around the question of representation, right, and a political voice. So then the argument for Pakistan also has to be rooted in the belief that communities need meaningful influence over their own political future, because now this brings us back to the origins of Pakistan, right? Influence over its own political future was the representation that was needed in 1947. And so today, to ensure that everyone has that representation and meaningful influence, it also has to be very intentionally curated. So in many ways, the question of women's representation, we could say, is part of the same democratic journey, right? And so it's an evolution. If representation mattered enough to shape the creation of the state, then it should also matter in how today's institutions function, correct? And so for me, the challenge is not simply looking and observing and getting more women into politics, but the challenge is building institutions that intentionally translate inclusion into influence. There's that bridge that we have to cross. From presence to influence. And when that happens, representation, we know, and scholarship tells us, and research tells us, becomes more than just a democratic principle. It becomes the foundation for a stronger, inclusive and thriving society.
Right. To summarize, quotas alone are insufficient. They do not constitute a substitute for substantive empowerment. What we need is that we need to look beyond quotas and look at the actual outcomes that are being produced by women legislatures as well as politicians in general. And we should be very wary of conflating mere inclusion or mere numbers with substantive outcomes, right? So, anything else that you would like to share with us before we conclude?
I would like to read a very short paragraph from my book about women's agency, because we've talked a little bit about women's agency. On page 68, I write, women's agency is understood through the lens of religion as a bridge between the realms of spiritual and social within the political space,
Right.
suggesting that the political expression of Islam is central to the empowering and personal agenda of the Muslim woman in Pakistan. Existing research defines and therefore understands women's participation in the public space through a very Western defined structure of modernity, development, democracy, and secularism. But for the purpose of this book's discussion on the topic, it is assumed that there is a lack of utilization of local sources of knowledge in an inquiry into women's representation in Pakistan. Therefore, this chapter examines local sources of knowledge, including data, concepts, and theories, in understanding local realities of women's agency in political representation in attempts to reflect beyond the collective fervor of Islamic nationalism, as mentioned in previous studies. And that's why it's important for us to engage in concepts of agency, participation, public spaces, political representation within the context of Pakistan.
Right, that's beautiful. I actually highlighted the very same line from where you started. And yeah, there is a lack of utilization of local sources of knowledge in an inquiry into women's representation in Pakistan, kind of summarizes the entire discourse.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, my final question, what I've observed is that over time you've become more and more interested in poetry and art and even architectural motifs. So what prompted that interest? Because initially when I first read your dissertation that you presented at university, it was not as replete with references to artistic and poetic themes as is this book. And even after the publication of this book, when I get to read your latest articles and op-eds for newspapers as well, I have observed, maybe I'm wrong, that you have, over the passage of time, you've become more and more interested in poetry. So, what's the reason behind all that? Are you a poet by nature? And have you done any poetry yourself?
I've dabbled in it a little bit. That's a very interesting observation. So the reason that I bring in a lot of literature and art expression, the reason I bring in expression into my study of society in general is because expression comes out when there is fear, there is oppression, when there are limitations of some sort. And so artists and writers and musicians, they're also storytellers in our society. And so when we're trying to understand society, systems, changes, I'm a firm believer that we have to include multi-sectoral approaches to bring in art and poetry and what our musicians are putting out within that context to really understand that time and place in society, because expression is also storytelling. So if we're missing the expression from our study, then we're missing more than half of the story, because numbers alone, as we know, do not tell the entire story. And so qualitative analysis, therefore, within social sciences is so important.
Right, that's beautiful. So anything else you would like to add?
Oh, but I do want to mention that it is important for us to define the Pakistani women's political space. And that has to happen from within Pakistan. It will have to happen from frameworks that are developed, that are conceived of and conceptualized from Pakistani scholars and from Pakistani women leaders themselves. Because otherwise, we continue to go down the path of the West and others defining what women's political representation looks like and what it needs to be.
Yeah, so women's political representation in Pakistan has to be studied by taking into account the local and lived realities, those existential experiences that women in Pakistan go through. They have to be actively incorporated. Otherwise, we run the risk of abstraction and right.
Absolutely, absolutely. You have to define yourself, and you have to tell your own story, because if you don't, then others will do it for you.
Right, that's beautiful. That's a beautiful take. So we would like to conclude here. Thank you so much for giving us your precious time, and we hope to keep on interacting with you in the future as well. Thank you so much for being with us.